Lack of affordable and decent housing options in the Joburg inner city has led to vulnerable people seeking refuge in abandoned or hijacked buildings. Since the Marshalltown fire that claimed 77 people, those who live and work in the inner city said there's always been a tragedy waiting to happen. Several NGOs, including the Socio-Economic Rights Institute, penned a joint statement on social challenges faced by vulnerable communities in the inner city. Now joined by SERI's Executive Director Nomzamo Zondo to unpack this. Nomzamo, appreciate your time. Now, a number of organisations issued this joint statement on the inner city crisis in Johannesburg. What is their collective message?
Thank you so much for having me, Hugo. You know, the collective message is that we hope that government will not disappear now that we've had the Albert Street fire and now that the attention about the fires died down. And the call is really for government to intervene, firstly to make sure that people have access to basic services, regardless of what of the building that they're living in. Make sure that living conditions that pose a risk to life and health are addressed. And if there are people who are living in the most unsafe conditions, that those people are moved to better accommodation. Our collective perspective is that many people live in the inner city because they don't have a choice. And those who are in the informal market, in those unsafe buildings are there because the formal market won't accommodate them, and the government programs are not deep enough to accommodate them. And we feel that for as long as government looks away, these conditions will continue. But if it can just make these three interventions we are suggesting, there is hope for the inner city.
Well, I'd like to get to a number of other questions, but let's talk about capacity or willingness of government, because this did not just happen for the first time a few weeks ago when those 77 people unfortunately lost their lives. It is almost a cycle, something that's been ongoing for a moment now. Does government have capacity? Is government prepared to deal with these issues?
One, we believe that government has capacity. I think the second question is more difficult to answer, about whether there is a political will to address those issues. There is this feeling that people who live in the inner city do not deserve to live there and are unworthy of government assistance and of government intervention. And that's the place both SERI, the Inner City Resource Center, the Inner City Federation, One-to-One and Plan Act would like to bring the state back to the table to say the residents of the inner city are also residents of the city of Johannesburg, they're also residents of this country, and they deserve a government intervention. And we actually believe, Mayor Mpopalatse, when she spoke about the inner city, she spoke about the inner city of Joburg as the lounge of Johannesburg, that even people who live in Soweto would find themselves crossing it. Those who live in Diepsloot would find themselves crossing it. And if as a result, if you don't address the inner city housing crisis, you don't address the state of the inner city, you're not only prejudicing those who live in the inner city, but you're prejudicing all of the residents of Joburg. And we believe that actually if there was an intervention, that would benefit all of us.
Now, you've suggested that government feels that these individuals are undeserving. Why do you think that?
One, I think, firstly, there is an unfortunate use of language. So this idea of hijacked buildings, which gives the impression that everyone who lives in unlawful occupation in the city is a criminal. Two, also, there is, to a limited extent, this idea that actually poor people should stay where they can't be seen and should stay where they can afford, which we understand it sometimes, and this has been spelled out by the state to say they must stay. We mustn't have the high levels of urbanization that we do. People must stay in the rural areas where there is no contestation around land and around buildings. That's one issue. But two, we all accept as a fact that we haven't addressed the land question. We had a land redistribution program in this country. And where that is felt most acutely is in the cities. And it is almost government guilt and its failure to address the land question that people who live in the inner city are looked upon as people who are bringing the problems that we have not yet dealt with to the fore.
It's part of this problem because many of these individuals are undocumented immigrants. In fact, some of them have been described as illegal immigrants.
So SERI has worked within the inner city of Joburg for over 10 years. And in our experience, in fact, the residents of the inner city are definitely majority South African, with maybe specific buildings having a high level of migrant occupiers. For instance, I, for one, was surprised to learn that half of the residents that have been housed post the 80 Albert Street fire are South Africans. In fact, in my own personal interactions of people who've lost family members, friends in the fire at 80 Albert Street, they were South Africans. I can give at least 2 examples where SERI has been involved, where clearly, where in one of the cases that we represented, people living on the corner of Sopa and 5th Street, and we had to fight for the state to relocate them, but those people were all South Africans. So it wasn't a matter of the state is not responding because it's not dealing with migrants, but it was just not responding because it just won't attend to this specific problem.
Now, there's a statement that's been said that describes the risk associated with living in abandoned buildings. Just what is that? What are some of those risks?
Look, I mean, so in some of these buildings, as we explained, there are no basic services, right? As highlighted by Albert Street, there is a fire risk, which is in South Africa actually a common risk, and I'm sure as we've all learned in the last 2 weeks, a fire risk is a common risk for most South Africans who are inadequately housed. So whether you're living in an informal settlement or you're living in a city building, you're facing that risk. One of the things that I think is almost ignored are also the opportunities. So people who live in abandoned buildings, in bad buildings in the inner city, are spending money on alternative sources of power, are spending money to get water. And if the state was providing those services, that could be revenue that could be going to the state. So in one finding themselves living in a bad building, chances are they are cut off from things that would actually make their lives safer and also make their lives better. And then unfortunately that they are put in a situation that could be depending on the state of the building, very bad, or could be just be bearable depending on the circumstances.
Now, there's something called the Emergency Housing Program. How does it relate to the situation in the inner city in Johannesburg?
So the Emergency Housing Program actually is one of the changes to the National Housing Code that came about looking at people who are inadequately housed, and it was the National Department of Human Settlements trying to make sure that there is a program and a funding scheme to address people who are living in those inadequate circumstances. So people who live in unsafe buildings would be people that the program would apply to. People who live in conditions that are a risk to their life, to their health, and to their safety would be people that are considered by this program. But this program specifically mandates municipalities to intervene when people are living in those circumstances, and then provides funding, which is managed by the province and granted through the national department to actually address those challenges. So for us, we feel that this program, which has been underutilized for the longest of time, could provide resources to municipalities across the country to address these living conditions. Definitely ensure that we don't have another 80 Albert Street fire situation, but also actually make sure that people are living in conditions that honor their dignity, that honor their humanity.
Now, there is a statement that is calling for professionals like engineers, planners, and architects to get involved in addressing the crisis. What role are they expected to play? And is it a practical proposal?
It's a practical proposal, Hugo, because when you ask the question about political will, I think the state itself feels like it doesn't have the capacity. But from where we stand, working with them and seeing what's happening within municipalities, we believe that they do have the capacity. But we believe that people like architects, like structural engineers, social workers even, are professionals who could come into the inner city housing crisis and provide their specialist expertise to resolve it so that the state doesn't feel that it needs all this money that it does not have, or money that it feels it does not have. If I can just give you an example, in most of the buildings that we work with, the buildings the rooms would be built with cardboard and makeshift materials, and then in that way it doesn't maximize space. In that way, there isn't actually a clear way of how you exit or enter the building in the midst of a crisis or an emergency. And someone like an architect can come in and say, actually, we can redesign this space and fit everyone that's here, or fit even more people than the people that are here, and still make it safe for everyone. In conversations with the MMC for public safety, he's raised the possibility of renovating these buildings while people still live in them, meaning that you could renovate floor by floor. Again, an architect coming in and assisting with the utilization of the space would help. When I speak about social workers, one of the things that we've learned through our work is that in any community, you can't just come in and just dump resources. You need to have a social process where members of the community buy in and see the value of what is being done. And community facilitation is a big part of this, where just make sure there's dialogue amongst the residents of the specific building, and actually having them work through and workshop the solutions to make their building safer or to improve their living conditions would go a long way in making sure that even if there are funds that are invested, that those funds are sustainable and that those changes are here in 20 years' time or in 30 years' time.
Nomzamo, the last time we had a conversation, it was on the back of a back and forth between your organisation and the city of Johannesburg, a lot of finger pointing, and all it seemed to suggest was that there were many areas that need to be resolved, but there was no point where you agree. There was a lot of, as I said, a lot of back and forth. Now, how much is this a contributory factor, the fact that there seems to be no common ground or little desire to find common ground, and for you and other organizations in a similar space, such as some of the NGOs that we talked about, the architects and other members of the South African citizenry that would like to come in and support? What is the process of getting all these parties to sit in a single room and agree on a way forward and make this happen before we have another disaster?
Look, in our work, we work with different spheres of government, from national, provincial, and the local state. In fact, we have an ongoing relationship with the city of Johannesburg. And you're right that in the midst of this crisis, almost everyone was there to say, but we could have resolved these issues a long time ago if some of the ideas that we'd put forward had been adopted. I think for us as SERI, it's been important. In fact, we have made the call to national government through the presidency to say, can you bring all of the parties to one table to discuss this issue and hold us as different stakeholders as the presidency. And we haven't yet, of course, received a response to that request that we've made. But we believe that, for instance, if the state is committed to resolving the inner city housing crisis, other people like NGOs like ourselves and other professionals who are willing to put their hands in will find space to contribute to that betterment. But it's going to be impossible if the only people that you're seeing on the ground are the NGOs, are the professionals, without the state. Because this challenge is huge. It's been there for a very, very long time. And it's also one that deserves state attention. It is the housing crisis in South Africa I don't want to say it's a nightmare that we've received from apartheid, but it's an ongoing problem. But one of the problems that should have been a priority for us, and therefore we do think that it should be a priority for government. And as an organization at SERI, we are willing to collaborate with the government at all spheres to resolve that. And we have we didn't just make this call to the presidency, but we made sure we reached out to the city. We reach out to the province, and even now, anyone who's willing to work with us, we are available. In fact, that's the reason why we've made the call, to say anybody who has a vision of the inner city that is inclusive, please come forward and lend a hand so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again.
Nomzamo Zondo, it's always a pleasure speaking to you, and I appreciate you unpacking those issues for us. Executive Director, Social Economics Rights Institute, talking to us about the Johannesburg inner city crisis and whether or not there's room for the poor. A reminder of our leading stories this hour.